Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Club program, Designing Babies, How Technology is Changing the Ways We Create Children. There are many ways in which the coronavirus pandemic has changed our lives and raised ethical, legal, and social issues. And there are also challenging issues that predate the pandemic and that will survive long after we have a vaccine. One of these is the issue of designing babies or assisted reproduction. You may have read the Washington Post article earlier this month about Bryce Cleary, who lives in Oregon and started donating sperm anonymously in 1989. Or at least he thought he donated anonymously. He recently did Ancestry.com testing, and now 3 decades later, at least 19 of his donor children from the sperm he supposedly donated anonymously have reached out to him, raising significant issues that we'll be discussing later. To help us navigate this challenging and important subject, I'm delighted to introduce my friend and renowned bioethicist, Dr. Robert Klitzman. He has spoken before many illustrious groups on the issue of bioethics during COVID, including the United Nations and the Inter-American Development Bank, and he spoke to the Princeton Club with me in June on that topic, and you can access that recording if you'd like to hear that talk as well. Tonight, he'll be speaking about his new book, Designing Babies, How Technology is Changing the Ways We Create Children. Since the first test tube baby was born over 40 years ago, in vitro fertilization, also called IVF, and other assisted reproductive technologies, or ARTs, have advanced in extraordinary ways, producing millions of babies. Dr. Klitzman's book, Designing Babies, examines the ethical, social, and policy concerns surrounding these reproductive technologies. Based on in-depth interviews with providers and patients, Dr. Klitzman explores how individuals and couples are facing quandaries of whether, when, and how to use IVF and other assisted reproduction techniques. As new technologies and possibilities are increasingly realized, potential parents, doctors, and policymakers face complex and critical questions about the use or possible misuse of ARTS. So an estimated 20% of American couples use infertility services to help them conceive, and that number is growing. Such technologies permit thousands of people, including gay and lesbian couples and single parents, to have offspring. The possibilities of this rapidly developing technology are astounding, especially in the US, where the procedures are practically unregulated and a large commercial market exists for buying and selling human eggs and freezing eggs. And who better to discuss this issue than Dr. Robert Klitzman, who's one of the country's leading bioethicists. Dr. Klitzman is director of the Master's Program in Bioethics at Columbia University and a member of the Division of Psychiatry, Law, and Ethics. He has written over 140 scientific journal articles, 9 books, and numerous chapters on critical issues in bioethics regarding genetics, neuroscience, doctor-patient relationships, and other topics. His books include The Ethics Police, The Struggle to Make Human Research Safe, Am I My Genes?, Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing, and the subject of tonight's discussion, Designing Babies, How Technology is Changing the Ways We Have Children. You can purchase his books on Amazon.com, and we'll be sharing links in the follow-up to this talk tonight. Dr. Klitzman has received numerous awards for his work, including fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. He served on the U.S. Department of Defense's Research Ethics Advisory Panel, and he's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, as well as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a regular contributor to the New York Times and CNN. You have likely seen a number of New York Times op-ed pieces by Bob in the last few months on the topic of COVID-19 and ethics, including a recent op-ed on the topic of masks titled, "If You See Someone Not Wearing a Mask, Do You Say Something?" A topic close to my heart, living in New York City. And I'm Wendy Gerber, president of the International Consulting Group, a global strategy and marketing consulting firm driving growth with a triple bottom line approach focused on revenue growth, social impact, and sustainability. I work with CEOs and senior business leaders to spearhead brand marketing and communication strategies and help companies lead with purpose as they build and reimagine their businesses in a post-COVID world. Like Bob, I'm a Princeton alum and also attended NYU Law and the Wharton School. Bob will speak tonight for about 45 minutes, and then he'll answer questions for 15 to 20 minutes. Please remember to click on the Q&A tab and write your questions in the box, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So to kick it off, Bob, before we get into the topic of your book, Designing Babies, how did you become interested in writing this book?
Well, thank you, Wendy, for the question, and also thank you for organizing this, and thank you to the Princeton Club, and thank you to all of you who are watching us now. So a few years ago, a friend of mine said, would you like to be a sperm donor for me? I want to have a child. She was in her late 30s and had not found the man of her dreams. I knew some of the guys she had dated over the years. It hadn't worked out. And she said, you only have to give me your sperm. You wouldn't have to do anything else. I'll raise the child. I'll be responsible for everything. And I thought, well, that's an interesting proposition. I don't have children of my own. And I thought, gee, here's a chance. Should I do this? And then I wondered, well, what would it mean? I mean, what would my relationship be with this child? He would be my flesh and blood. Did I feel comfortable having her raise a child? So that was one point that made me begin to think about this. And then, as you mentioned, I wrote a previous book called Am I My Genes? Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing. And for that book, I interviewed people who are at risk of different genetic diseases or diseases for which there's a strong genetic test. And one of the diseases is Huntington's disease. Woody Guthrie, the famous singer-songwriter who sang "This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land," died of Huntington's disease. If I have the disease, for instance, there's a 50% chance that each of my children will have it. And if they have it, they'll die of it. 100% chance if they don't die of something else first. So Arlo Guthrie, for instance, who's the son of Woody Guthrie, has had to debate, does he want to get this test done, which would be a death sentence? So I interviewed people who were at risk of this disease, and one woman I interviewed who was at risk said, I said, what's it like? She said, well, the biggest issue I face, she said, is should I have kids? Should I abort a fetus if it has my mutation? Should I screen embryos? There's this new procedure that we'll be talking about called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where before an embryo is entered into the womb in IVF, you could test it for hundreds of things. And so you could screen out embryos. And she said, if I do that to have a child, or she said, or should I not get married? Should I not have kids at all? She said, but if I decide to screen my embryo or abort a fetus with my mutation, I would have been aborted. I would have been screened out. And what am I saying about the value of my own life if I would have prevented me from being born? I mean, yes, I know I'm going to die from this in about age 50. I'm now in my 30s, but I feel I've had a good life. So again, I began to wonder about this technology where we can now screen embryos for diseases through IVF. We can now make children from parents who may never meet. There are people who are buying and selling sperm. People are buying and selling eggs. And so I began to wonder, what is this world that we've entered? and it's advancing very quickly. Just to show you a quick slide, this is, just one moment here. Hold on, sorry, wrong thing here. Just one sec, sorry about that. Right, okay, so this, can you see this? This is me recently with Louise Brown, who was the first test tube baby. She's now 40. So 40 years ago was the first time IVF was done. There were covers of Time magazine and Newsweek. Remember, Time and Newsweek and covers were important of magazines. And this was thought to be this wonderful or terrible thing. She's now 40, she's normal. But since then, as you said, there are millions of people born all over the world every year using IVF and using these technologies. So I thought this would be interesting to explore and try to understand.
So I'm not sure you actually ever told us the answer to the question, though. What did you tell your friend? Yay or nay?
Well, so I investigated it and then ultimately passed. I thought that this would be too weird for me to do. I should say that earlier in medical school and at Yale, there was a friend of mine, one of my best friends in the dorm, first year of medical school, said, hey, I'm donating sperm. You get $75. Let's go do this. And even then I thought it was weird, but I sort of dismissed it. And I look back now and wondered how many children he sired. Of course, that's the case that you mentioned in the Washington Post, where there are people who were sperm donors in the past who now have, in one case, up to 150. And there's a guy in Britain who says that he has created 800 children using his sperm.
And did he know that before, or he just found out because of genetic testing?
Well, the guy with the 800 wants to get up to 1,000, so he knows. And again, it shows how unregulated this is, even in the United Kingdom, which has a more regulated IVF industry than we do. In this country, there have been a few cases of people who've created 150 children without knowing. Some don't know it and some do. There was actually, I was asked to write a review for Slate of a new show last year on Fox called Almost Family, which is based on the case of a IVF doctor who used his own sperm to create hundreds of children. And in the Fox TV show, the children began to meet. The opening scene is a young man in his 20s meets a young woman in her 20s in a bar. They go and have sex and then find out they're in fact have the same father. Leave it to Fox to get right to the chase. So these are major issues in our society today, and they've gotten, I find, relatively little attention, and people don't know much about them. I was amazed. My eyes were constantly open as I did the research and wrote the book.
It's fascinating and frightening at the same time. So you've shared with me that assisted reproduction enables adults who were not able to have children previously to have them. And these advancing technologies have produced over 1 million babies in the US. What are some of the reasons that people might want or need to become involved with assisted reproduction?
Right, so great question. So it turns out that 10% of all men and 10% of all women are infertile. That means that for whatever biological reasons, they're unable to have children. So that means that on average, 20% of couples are unable to have children if they want children. Not all couples want children, but of those that do, 20% can't. So that's a lot of people. And I should say in the past, people would often adopt. It's gotten much harder to adopt. People had adopted infants from China and Guatemala for a while, and then those countries decided it's sort of uncool to have us exporting babies to the US. Why can't we take care of our own babies? With the ability of women to have abortions, there are fewer unwanted babies in the world. Knock on wood that that'll stay the case. And so you have 20% of couples who are infertile biologically. Then you have a lot of women who were fertile when they were in their late 20s or early 30s, and they decided to delay starting a family in order to pursue their careers and education. So they're now in their late 30s and want to have kids. And it's much more difficult for a woman in her late 30s to become pregnant. And so you have additional people who seek to have assisted reproductive technologies such as IVF. And you also have gay, lesbian couples and individuals. You have gay men, gay couples, lesbians. You have people who are transgender. You also have people who are single parents by choice. So my friend, for instance, the woman I mentioned, who in her late 30s hadn't found a guy, and she decides she wants to, will choose a sperm donor. She asked me, I said no, obviously. I don't know if she asked other friends, or she then could go to a sperm bank and choose traits or drop-down menus. You can choose hair color, eye color. Some sperm banks allow you to choose the movie star you like best. You can say, I want someone who looks like Brad Pitt, for instance, or I want a Princeton PhD, or I want, blonde hair, blue eyes, 6 foot high, captain of the football team at Harvard, whatever it is. You can choose different categories. So there are people who are single mothers by choice, single fathers by choice. So this leads to a lot of people.
So I think on a somewhat related topic, I understand that many young women are freezing their eggs. How many are doing this, and what are the reasons and your thoughts about this?
Yeah, so this is a new industry in which women can, a young woman, say in her 20s, can say, look, I know my fertility will go down, but I want to have a job, I want to pursue a career, so I'll freeze my eggs. And I should say that women have the same number of eggs, are born with all the eggs that they'll ever have, and the eggs decrease in quality over time. And this is why there are higher risks of Down syndrome, for instance, as women get older, et cetera, and other kinds of abnormalities. So a lot of companies are now offering to freeze their female employees' eggs. So Apple, Facebook, Google, who don't want to lose their very smart, young, talented women who are working for them because they'll want to get nervous and I have to raise a family, start a family now, so they'll freeze eggs for them. It costs around $50,000 plus to freeze your eggs. So it's a hefty price tag. Again, some companies will pay for this, but not all. Women will do this, so they often do this because this way they'll feel they don't need to worry about having their eggs decrease in quality. The problem is that the quality of the frozen eggs is not clear. So there have been no studies of how good are the eggs 10 years from now, partly because the technology's not existed that long, and also because people haven't really studied it. Also, there have been unfortunate cases where the eggs which are stored in freezers will break, or there'll be a blackout, or just electricity goes out, or power fails in the building, or whatever it is. And so there have been hundreds of thousands of eggs that have been lost. Also, a lot of women freeze their eggs and it turns out they haven't frozen enough eggs. So they'll freeze, say, 8 eggs. Well, in IVF, what happens is, sperm meets egg, or I can do this differently, but sperm meets egg forms an embryo of 1 cell that then splits and becomes 2 cells, then 4, then 8, then 16, 32, eventually a human being. And then you implant those into the womb, into the uterus, and you hope that you hope that they implant and lead to a pregnancy. Well, not every egg leads to a pregnancy. Some don't fertilize, some get transferred and don't implant. There could be miscarriages, et cetera. And so some women who say may only freeze 8 eggs, that may not be enough, depending on other things. And of course, it becomes harder to get pregnant even with a younger egg as you get older, though women can get pregnant later in life. And there have been cases, for instance, in India, of a woman who's 72 years old who got pregnant using another woman's eggs. I should say her husband, who was 80, had a stroke the next week and was in the hospital, and I understand never got out. So there are obviously a lot of ethical, social, psychological issues that come up with this. So the bottom line is people are freezing their eggs, but a concern I have is that people don't realize their potential limitations. So women should not freeze their eggs thinking, wow, now I don't have to think about it at all. I'm perfectly safe. This is guaranteed. it's not guaranteed. I mean, it can help many women, but people should realize that things can go wrong. It may not be a guarantee, et cetera.
It's fascinating and does raise a lot of issues. And I'm amazed that 20% of couples are infertile. It's a huge number.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people, you know, as I began to do this research, I should say a lot of people I know and people you know have said to me, oh, we used IVF. And I never would have guessed that. You know, I mean, how does one know? And one of the problems and the reason this hasn't gotten much attention as a field is these are taboo topics. So it's sort of taboo to talk about sex, right? Oh, we're not having sex, we are having sex, whatever it is. I mean, that's sort of off the table. It's general social conversation, by and large. I mean, you may talk with your best friend, but it's not widely known. These kinds of things aren't things people talk about usually. And there's a lot of shame around infertility. A lot of guys feel that they're not macho if they don't have kids, that there's something wrong with them. A lot of couples who try to get pregnant feel tremendous pressure to have children. Often their parents, potential grandparents will say, you know, when are you going to give me grandkids? The young women I find who are infertile say that all their friends are having kids, and it's very, very difficult. People told me as I interviewed them for the book that, you know, I feel I'm not part of the parent club, that people assume we don't want to have kids, that we're too concerned with our careers and we're busy trying. And if we keep talking about you, we had a miscarriage, we had another miscarriage, people don't want to hear about that. And it's difficult to undergo miscarriages. It's like a death, some people have told me when I interviewed from the book. So a lot of this is just not talked about. And then people who do IVF often won't say it, they'll just have the child. And of course, people who use sperm donors and egg donors, as we'll talk about, also don't talk about it. That's not my genetic child. Again, because there's shame, there's fear that the child will say, well, you know, you're not really my father, you're not really my mother. Turns out that's not the case, but if children are told early and appropriately.
So in your book, Designing Babies, you note, and I quote, now we can affect the DNA of our offspring, eliminating certain genes and ensuring that others are present, end quote. As scientists discover genes associated not only with diseases, but various characteristics such as deafness, dwarfism, homosexuality, or intelligence, doctors will be capable of screening embryos for these traits as well. So scientists can now also alter the genes of an embryo and its descendants. With these extraordinary advances, what's happening, and is it good or bad?
Sorry, great question. So there are several things happening, and this again is a rapidly advancing field. COVID has sort of taken over the news cycle, and of course the presidential election has taken over the news cycle, but there's still a lot going on this and changing. So there are several ways we can affect the genes of our offspring. One is, as I mentioned, with Huntington's disease, is through pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGT, in which when an embryo is 30 cells or 60 cells, we can remove 2 or 3 and see what genes they have. So we can say, well, these are the boy embryos, these are the girl embryos. These are the ones that have a gene for Huntington's, for instance, or for breast cancer, or for different kinds of colon cancer. And people are now saying, gee, I have breast cancer in my family, and I have the gene, or my mother has the gene for breast cancer, and I want to screen the embryos and only use the embryos that don't have the breast cancer gene. So, excuse me. And I would say that there are two kinds of things we can screen for. One are diseases, and diseases vary from Huntington's, which is going to kill you, to breast cancer, which you could say if a child does have the breast cancer gene, a gene that increases risk of breast cancer. It's not 100%. About 10% of all breast cancer is the genetic kind. If you have the gene, there's around a 50% chance you'll get breast cancer. So if you have the gene, it's only 50-50 you'll get the disease. And if this is a future child, the disease probably won't show up till the child's in her 40s or 50s, by which time there may be treatment. So again, there are different kinds of diseases in terms of when they affect you that we can screen for. So there are diseases, and then there are, quote, social traits, socially desirable traits. So people now saying, I only want a boy. And there are couples who come to the US from other countries, particularly countries in East Asia, South Asia, sometimes the Middle East, who say, I want a boy, I only want a boy, and we give them a boy. We are finding genes that are associated with IQ. For instance, at some point we'll find genes associated with intelligence, blonde hair, blue eyes, etc. We're beginning to find genes associated with eye color and hair color. People could potentially screen for that. It turns out that there are genes that certain kinds of Olympic athletes are more likely to have. And people could say, I want my child to be an Olympic athlete. I want to see which embryos have those genes. So all these things are possible. What's of more concern is that we can now also alter the genes in the embryo. So there's a process called CRISPR, and this allows us to go in and basically cut out certain genes or put in certain genes. So we can now potentially put in genes that'll give you a little bit of extra IQ. We can take out genes that may cause disease. 3 years ago in China, and I should say, this process was discovered in yogurt, or a lot of the early research was done in yogurt after it was discovered that yogurt bacteria actually can cut out genes of viruses. And people began to realize, well, if yogurt could do that, why can't we do that? And so this was extended to plants. And so we have, many of the vegetables and fruits that we eat have been genetically engineered. We have tomatoes that look perfectly red and taste awful, but they look good. We have seedless fruits and vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. Also, a lot of this was genetically engineered, and of course, there's genetically modified organisms. GMO has been a source of a lot of debate. So this was done in animals and in fruits and vegetables. And then 3 years ago, a Chinese scientist did this to the human embryo, and there was a world outcry. And so it was decided that it's okay to do that, but you should not implant the embryo into the womb, to create a human. And then about 1.5 years ago, a Chinese scientist did that and created children. I can go into the details, but it turns out that this is still a very crude process. So he was supposed to only cut out this much DNA. He cut out too much DNA. He violated all the sort of international ethical agreements about this. But this is the future. And the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, with assisted reproductive technologies now, it's basically a relatively unregulated industry in the United States. There's only 3 countries in the world where you can buy and sell human eggs: Russia, India, and the United States. It's illegal in all of Western Europe. In the US, it's the Wild West. We have doctors in the US who, if something's not allowed in the US, they'll go to Mexico or somewhere else to have it done with their patient from New York or wherever. And so it's very hard to have world governance in these areas or anything else. And so, unfortunately, I think there's a real threat that there are people who may begin to alter the genes of embryos for whatever social reasons, not just medical reasons, as we move forward. So I think one of the cautionary tales in the book is that the need to think through these issues and all the potential abuses and unethical things that occur. So as in other technologies, this is a double-edged sword. We can use these technologies to get rid of serious diseases, or we can also do things that will affect social issues. To give an example, wealthy people can now afford to get rid of breast cancer genes from their children. Well, poor people cannot, since it costs around $50,000. And so breast cancer, which now unfortunately affects both wealthy and poor, in the future may increasingly become a disease of poor people, and therefore there may be less research, less treatment available, et cetera.
I know you were talking about the Chinese doctor, and it's astonishing that occurred. When you said that he cut out more of the chromosomes than he was supposed to, did the babies actually, were they born with problems and issues because of that?
We don't know. I mean, so far as I know, no one has seen, there've been no report on what the babies are like, either now or in the future. And of course, the problem is if you cut out, so what he did was he worked with fathers who had HIV, HIV/AIDS, and there's a gene that helps HIV get into cells called CCR5. So he disabled that gene. The problem is that if you disable that gene, it decreases the likelihood of HIV getting in cells, but it increases the risk of influenza getting in cells, of West Nile virus getting in cells, et cetera. And there's good treatment for HIV, and there's sperm washing, so he didn't need to do it. But many genes do many things. So, you know, the same gene may be involved in intelligence or in functioning of the heart or the liver. So we'll have to see what happens with these children as they get older. It's a great question, though.
Any of these treatments, this is kind of beyond what we're talking about, but it's fascinating. And are any of these treatments, these gene alterations, applicable as we're adults, where we're as kind of an advance to confront disease, to actually alter our genes as we're alive and living?
Yes, and I should say, so that's gene therapy, which I think has a lot of hope. So you could, let's say someone has cancer where there's a malfunctioning gene, you could potentially, for an adult, use gene therapy and insert the functioning gene, or use CRISPR to alter the genes that the cells that have the malfunctioning gene. And that, I think, ethically does not have these same problems. The problem is when you alter the genes of an embryo, you are, first of all, the child can't consent. Oh yes, go ahead and experiment on my brain or my liver or whatever, the genes involved. But it's going to affect not only that child, but that child's children, et cetera, et cetera. And so if someone already has cancer and they give consent for what's done in their own body, that's one thing. But to affect a future child who has no say, when we don't know the full effects, is more complicated. And even now with adults, it's done on an experimental basis.
During COVID, many of us are spending time reading books and streaming shows. The book, The Brave New World, describes a future society that manufactures people in artificial wombs. In The Handmaid's Tale, one of my favorites, a totalitarian theocracy forces fertile women to reproduce for other parents. While these examples are not exactly the same, we face crucial moral, social, cultural, and psychological conundrums about how to employ these new technologies, whether to monitor or control them, and if so, how. You mentioned that New York State recently joined California and a few other states in legalizing contracts for so-called renting wombs, where prospective parents can pay a woman to carry a fetus for them in her womb to produce a child for them. What do you think of that?
Great question. So this is a complicated topic. So there's a large industry of, quote, renting wombs, as you say, which is, let's say, a gay couple, for instance, or a woman who for some reason can't use her own womb, or say actresses. Sarah Jessica Parker, for instance, didn't want to have a child, but she didn't want to actually carry the child. So you can have another woman carry an embryo for you in her womb and produce a child. And if everyone's a consenting adult, this ethically looks like it in many cases should be okay. In New York State, California has had this legalized for a number of years. In New York State, it has been illegal. And last year, a year ago, June, the New York State Senate voted to legalize this. It went to the Assembly, and at that point, Gloria Steinem came out very publicly and was quoted in the New York Times saying this is a terrible law, a terrible bill, because it will lead to human trafficking, that there'll be women brought into New York State from other countries to carry children in their wombs, and that this will exploit poor women, particularly poor women of color, who will be basically carrying children for wealthy people. So I think the other side ignored these complaints, and I should say what happened is that Governor Cuomo this past June legalized it in New York State by just including it in his budget. So it's now legal in New York State. A problem is, though, that we don't know, is it the case that this is going to exploit poor women and poor women of color? There's been very little data on this, it turns out, and I've written a little bit about this and write about this in the book. Turns out there's only been one study ever done of women who are paid as gestational surrogates. That's in this case where they're not providing their own egg, but just using another woman's egg and someone else's sperm. They're just providing the womb. So the one study was published in 1998, 22 years ago, and had only 15 such women in it. So we have no idea who these women are. This is today, there are thousands of women undergoing this. About 20% are from other countries. Most of the commissioning parents in this country are gay men, gay couples. But I think there is, so I think there needs to be a registry of seeing, we need data. I mean, are they poor women? Do they understand this? Or et cetera, is one. And I do think that 90-day, so the law that Cuomo passed requires that a woman only be in New York State for 90 days. So that could lead to human trafficking. I think that is a concern. There has been a multi-million-dollar industry in other countries of women renting their wombs. In India for a number of years, where in this country, I should say, it costs about $100,000, $120,000 to hire someone to carry your child. In India, it's about $3,000. And so a lot of people went to India and paid Indian women. Often the Indian women's husbands would take the money rather. And in some cases, the child was stuck because there was one case of a Japanese couple that commissioned a Indian mother to carry the child. While she was pregnant, the Japanese couple divorced. Neither wanted the child. And so there was a Japanese child born to this Indian mother in India. She didn't want the child. She said she had 6 children of her own. And so the child was born stateless and unwanted. Eventually, one of the grandparents in Japan said they'll take the child. But now in Ukraine, there's a huge industry of women who are renting their wombs. So again, we don't know, these women willing to do this, or they being forced to do it. So there's a lot of concerns. I think there's nothing wrong with it in principle, but we want to make sure that it's done ethically, that people understand the risks, etc.
And in the inverse, does the problem occur sometimes where the woman who's carrying the baby in her womb then decides that after going through this, she wants to actually keep the baby as her own?
Yes, so this is why the contracts have been illegal and were illegal in New York State and still are illegal in many, many states. What the contract says is that the woman agrees to carry the child and then to give it up. There was a case actually around the time that we graduated from Princeton in the 1980s of Baby M. And this was in New Jersey. There was a couple, I think the name was the Steiners, and she had, I think, multiple sclerosis, and therefore was afraid that if she got pregnant, it would worsen her disease. And so the Steiners put an ad in the newspaper in New Jersey saying, we're looking for a woman who can carry a child. So a woman came forth, Mary Beth Whitehead. And so Mr. Steiner impregnated her. She provided both the egg and the womb, therefore. That's called a traditional surrogacy. And gave birth. And when she gave birth, said she wants to keep the child. So it went to the court. One court said she could keep the child. It was overturned. It became a huge mess legally. And New Jersey then said that she can have some visitation rights, but all such contracts are void in the state of New Jersey. And so what's happened now is the industry has separated egg donors from women who provide their womb, gestational surrogates, so that there are 3 parties involved: the father, the egg donor, or the woman providing the egg, and the gestational surrogate. So the woman can't say, well, I have 2/3 of the ingredients, if you will, and therefore court won't say, well, clearly the child belongs to either the gestational surrogate or the egg donor. I should say there have been debates in Israel, for instance, since the definition of being Jewish is being born to a Jewish mother. There have been debates about whether if you're born to a Jewish surrogate, but the egg is not Jewish. Are you Jewish? In many countries have looked at these issues differently, and I should say paid gestational surrogacy is illegal in all of Western Europe. You can cover basic expenses like, cab fare, but in this country, women get paid $90,000, and those kinds of amounts are just unheard of for various reasons.
So speaking of costs and payments, what is the cost of infertility treatment in the United States, and what kind of insurance coverage exists for assisted reproduction, and what does this mean in terms of cost as a barrier, and who can actually take part in assisted reproduction?
So great questions, very important questions. And I talk about this in the book in the chapter called How Much is a Child Worth? So it turns out it's expensive. So one cycle of IVF costs around $25,000. Most IVF cycles fail overall. So often you need to do 2, sometimes 3 cycles, which would be $50,000 or $75,000. And it's expensive. So a lot of couples can't afford it. Increasingly, there have been some states that have said that insurance companies need to provide some coverage, but they may provide $5,000 or 1 cycle of IVF. Some states say that to get that money, you need to be a married heterosexual couple. So that eliminates various people. Some employers, like Columbia University, for instance, I'm sure Princeton, sort of more, progressive-minded employers will have some coverage in their insurance policy, but it's often not enough. They'll say they'll cover $10,000, say. So these are issues. There are people who say, there's a question, should insurance cover more of this? Some people say that infertility is not a disease. You can live a healthy life and be infertile. And there's concern that if insurance companies do cover it, do they cover it for all gay couples, lesbian couples, single women, single mothers, et cetera. So I think this is a large area that doesn't get much attention, but is very important. Especially a lot of women feel that, particularly women, also men, that having a child is an incredibly important part of their life. That there are people, very successful people who are presidents and CEOs of foundations and companies who've told me that the most valuable, meaningful thing in their life is having children. We wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be here as a species if there wasn't a very strong biological and psychological urge to have children. And so people are willing to spend a lot of money. There are, as I talk about in the book, there are couples who tell me that, they've emptied out their life savings to have a child. One young woman said she had saved up money to graduate school. She's used all that money up for infertility treatment. This is her last cycle. She hopes it works. Unfortunately, it didn't work. There are couples that have debates about this. So a few men said things like, quote, my wife wants me to sell my motorcycle so she can have another cycle of IVF to have a child. Well, screw that. So couples may have different willingness to go into debt to have a child. And unfortunately, these are very stressful issues that require putting a price tag on a future child and on being a mother or father. And these are, again, this is area of concern. Basically in bioethics, we look at these issues where technologies have forced us to face difficult social, psychological, ethical issues in our lives.
So we've talked about the fact that 10% of adults are infertile and 20% of couples. But what percentage of these people are actually exploring or using assisted reproduction?
So it depends on the country and how much coverage there is. So in Denmark, as of several years ago, 5 years ago, 7% of all children born in Denmark were born through IVF, were born through assisted reproductive technologies. In this country, it's varied by state. It's up to 2 to 4% in some states. It's much less in other states, and also by cities. So in cities where there are young women who are working professionals, many of them are delaying having children and therefore facing fertility problems. So it's going to be higher than in other areas. But there are, so as I said, it's up to 2 to 4% of all births in some areas of our country.
So we've talked about the fact that the old concept that everyone was so afraid of during Hitler's time of trying to create an Aryan race can be one of the very negative side effects of these technological advancements. But even as people are selecting the chromosomes and genes that they want in their children, it doesn't always work. You mentioned in your book that a psychologist and single mother by choice picked a sperm bank for men with doctorates, and their identities were listed, yet her son ultimately had language delays. How much of this process is a bit of a genetic crapshoot?
So it is. There's a famous anecdote, which is there was George Bernard Shaw once got a letter from a very famous, beautiful Spanish actress who said, "Just think, Mr. Shaw, if we had children, our children would have my looks and your brains." And he wrote back saying, "Yes, but what if they have my looks and your brains?" It is a crapshoot, and a lot of this is at times the narcissism of parents who want to sort of create a child just like them, or they want a Brad Pitt without thinking. Be careful what you bargain for. So saying I just want IQ and then have a children who has no social skills, as in the book, and language delays lead to problems. At the same time, people are now facing these very real issues, even with buying and selling eggs. I'll show you one other set of images here. So there are a lot of websites that we can buy and sell human eggs. So here's one website, and this is theeggdonor.com. And if you look on the left, there is Caucasian egg donors, Chinese, Hispanic, Japanese. If you look on the bottom, there's Jewish egg donors, Islamic egg donors. Here's another website. This is egg-donors.com. And if you look, there are drop-down menus of age, race, height, skin, eyes, hair color, availability, state. The prices of eggs goes up with your SAT scores, for instance, and people pay a lot. There used to be price caps. There no longer are, for reasons we can talk about. This is another website. This is drairy.com. Here there are blondes, brunettes. They sort of look, they're all wearing makeup and they sort of like escorts. So the question is, what are people buying? What do they think they're buying? What if they choose a beautiful woman's eggs and the child turns out to not be that attractive or have other kinds of problems or et cetera? So there are major issues, and also a lot of young women who decide they want to donate eggs. They do this for money, of course, but they don't realize that they have a risk of getting ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, that in terms of getting injected with multiple doses of steroids. They have increased risks of cancer as a result. So again, I think that there's often not good informed consent. The women don't understand what they're getting themselves into. Again, I think that it's possible to do this, but I think it needs to be done ethically in a way that women understand what they're getting themselves into. A lot of women sign up for this, and then they undergo genetic testing and find out they have genes for breast cancer, say. They don't have insurance, and so they thought they'd be earning tens of thousands of dollars, and instead they find out they're at higher risk for medical diseases and don't have insurance for it. So I think there needs to be better policy overseeing the industry.
And it's fascinating that, as you call it, the Wild West, that the United States, which is so highly regulated in many areas, including medications, is kind of a Wild West with regard to artificial reproduction. And that brings me to our next point, which is going back to the Bryce Cleary story.
Yes.
He donated his sperm anonymously in 1989 when he was a med student, right around the time you were at Yale, and somebody suggested you do it. And whereas in 2005, the United Kingdom stopped anonymous sperm donation in the interests of children born through that method and required that all children, once they hit age 18, should know and be able to contact their biological fathers. Theoretically, in the United States, anonymous sperm donation remains the norm. But for example, Bryce Cleary, and you've cited many cases in which there are even more children created out of the sperm. He was told his sperm would be sent to the East Coast. He was based in Oregon, and would be implanted in at most 5 women. He received a Christmas gift to Ancestry.com from his wife. And lo and behold, just as soon as he received his genealogical results, he also started to get contacted by his donor children, who had also done Ancestry.com testing and came up as a match. So now there are at least 19 donor children who've reached out. He has his own family and says he's now tormented by questions running through his mind, starting with whether the 2 women who were married to his sons could potentially be his donor children, whether his 3rd son's fiance could potentially be a donor child. So there are also practical and moral issues. He feels an obligation to share his medical history with his donor children, and he wonders what his additional obligations are to them when he already has a family of his own and never expected to have to confront this dilemma. What are your thoughts about this, Bob?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is not uncommon. There are cases of people having, up to 150 such kids. I think that unfortunately, anonymity no longer exists in this realm because of Ancestry.com, 23andMe, et cetera. The notion that you can donate sperm and it's anonymous is gone. I think that I think that people have the right to know, at least have medical information about their parents. A problem is that most people who were created through donor sperm or eggs do not know that. So most parents do not tell their kids, gee, actually, we had someone else who helped bring you into the world. I think this is unfortunate. It turns out that parents are afraid my child will love me less, but it turns out that such secrecy often backfires. So the child finds out through 23andMe that, my God, you're not my father. Why didn't you tell me this? Or Aunt Sally blurts it out in an argument, that's not even your real mother, quote unquote. These things have happened. So it turns out that psychological studies show that it's best if parents tell children from an early age, gee, a nice man, a nice woman helped us bring you into the world, etc. Plus, increasingly we know that one's heredity, diseases in one's family increase one's own risk of certain diseases. So if you have a history of heart disease in your family, that increases your risk of heart disease. And so it's important that you know the medical history of your biological parents. So I think it's only last year that the American Society for Reproductive Medicine recommended that clinics keep records of who was born to who. I think it needs to be stronger than that. I think there needs to be a registry. This already exists in many countries in Europe. In Ireland, when you're 18, you have a right to get your birth certificate. And on that birth certificate, it says who your biological parents are, or if you're created through donor sperm or eggs. And I think people have a right to know that information. This may be controversial. The industry does not want this. They're afraid that donations will drop. But when Britain decided to no longer have anonymous donations, donations dropped briefly, but then went back up. So I think that children have a right to this information. Ethically, in a lot of these issues, the rights of the unborn child are ignored. We talk about other examples of that.
So we've got 2 more questions, but I want to remind our viewers, then we're going to be taking your questions. So please start clicking on the Q&A tab and adding your questions, and we'll be delighted to get to them soon. Another topic that's of a great deal of interest is save your siblings. When a child is born through in vitro fertilization to provide an organ or stem cell transplant to a sibling affected with a fatal disease, as in the novel and film Never Let Me Go. What are your thoughts in this context, Bob?
Yeah, so again, I think the Ishiguro novel and the film Never Let Me Go illustrates some of the potential problems with this. So what we can do now is, let's say there are children and also parents who have certain diseases where they need stem cell transplants, organ transplants, etc. So it is now possible, and people do this, to design a child who will be able to be an organ donor or stem cell donor for the parents. So you can look at you can choose the embryo that is an immunological match, for instance. It hopefully doesn't have the disease, but is an immunological match. It could donate. And this is done. And I think that it creates potential problems because, and we need more research to understand how do these children feel about this. So in other words, children may say, well, I'm sick of being a stem cell donor for my father or my sister. Or they may say, gee, I'm so grateful that I was created for this purpose to, be able to help my family members. There's no studies on this, and this is a shame. We need to understand how do people look at this, how do they feel about it. Certainly the novel and film, Never Let Me Go, show a very horrific situation, which there are farms of people who created to then be killed to donate their organs. You could see how this could lead to abuses. And so again, we need to be very careful how this is done. Right now, there are very few guidelines about it. And again, the problem is that the consent of the child doesn't occur, right? The child can't say, no one's thinking about what are the rights and feelings of the unborn child. So I think that it's important that we find out more to know how to proceed.
Certainly raises a lot of issues, and it seems fitting to end our questions with the issue that in 1988, the English scientist Francis Galton drew on the work of his half-cousin, Charles Darwin, to argue that society should encourage the selection of the fittest genes. Eugenics means good genes in Greek, but is now properly defined as the purposeful selection of certain genes over others. And many observers worry that patients' choices of egg donors today, based on traits such as height, blonde hair, blue eyes, Ivy League education, begin to constitute eugenics. What's your view on this, Bob?
So we need to proceed very cautiously, as you say. So eugenics, unfortunately, went to horrific ends under Hitler, right? Where it's decided to better the genes of society. We will get rid of the bad genes, gypsies, Jews, homosexuals, etc. In fact, Hitler got his ideas on eugenics from the United States. So Woodrow Wilson was a eugenicist. He believed that genes of blacks were inferior, major problem. And there were other eugenicists in the 1920s as waves of immigrants came over to the United States from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe. There were eugenics fairs in the Midwest, in Nebraska and Kansas, where there were awards given to the best pumpkin, the best pig, the best apple, and also the best gene, the best family tree. And a lot of this were white nativists who believe in white supremacy, basically. So I think we have to be very careful, given this history, of what we do with this and where we go with it.
Quite well said. And I don't see any open questions. You've certainly provided a lot of answers. I do see one clarification. Somebody mentioned that baby M's family's last name was Stern, William and Betsy Stern.
Or not Steiner. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for that clarification. Does anybody want to share any additional questions with us? Bob, you've done such a great job answering all these conundrums and policy issues that I guess we don't have any questions from the audience, but I want to thank you for taking the time to share your tremendous insights with us, Bob. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. The Princeton Club is recording the talk, and we'll be sending everyone the link to the recording, as well as a link to buy Bob's book, Designing Babies. And we hope you'll join the Princeton Club for other interesting upcoming virtual events. I'll be hosting another talk on October 14th with Mark Fisher of the Washington Post and journalists from ABC News, the National Review, and Bloomberg about the virus vote, electing a president during a pandemic. And after the election on November 18th, I'll be speaking with George Will about what the election means to our country and the world. And Jay, we're happy that one of our classmates is on. Thank you for your note. And thank you to everyone, especially Bob, for joining us this evening. Everyone, please stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you very much. Great to see you all. Great to see some familiar names. And as Wendy said, stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you.